Hello everyone. I hope all of you are safe and fine. So today I'll be covering a keynote that I gave at the ServiceNow webinar in early September 2021. And this keynote is about bringing philosophical ideas to design. But before we get started, a little bit about me. I've been designing products for quite a while now. I started as a freelancer, and since then I have worked at various startups and MNCs along with founding my own startup. I began my journey at ServiceNow in 2019, and it has been pretty awesome since then. On the side, I'm also a design mentor for Google for Startups, and I recently completed my master's in philosophy that has indeed inspired this talk. With the central question, can we bring philosophical ideas to design? Now, philosophy comes from the word philosophia in Greek, which means the love of wisdom. And well, wisdom requires thinking. I'm sure you have heard about thinking in the design world too, the well known term design thinking. Well, be it philosophy or design, thinking is what we do to navigate through problems. So it's natural that the central topic of this talk is thinking. Now, when I refer to thinking, it's not just design thinking that we are familiar with, but thinking as a conscious, directed activity of the mind. Something that Kahneman referred to as slow thinking or systems 2 thinking. Now, we all default to fast thinking, something that we do day in, day out. But we do employ slow thinking when, let's say, we are solving math problems or puzzles. So, whenever I read philosophy, or for that matter, anything else, there is this tendency to connect it with design. And sometimes it leads to deeper insights. There is always this designer lens that comes into play. So, I have taken the liberty to apply some of these philosophical ideas to design. Now, some of the things that I read in philosophy can be directly linked to our design practice. These philosophical ideas can be used to make improvements to our methods and processes, the way we define and implement them. On the other end of the spectrum, we have reflexivity or meta thoughts, which I think is fundamental to every philosopher. And doing philosophy has also made me think meta about design. So I have deliberated on what is design and why do we design the way we design. But you might ask here, why do meta thinking? What's the purpose of meta design? So let me take a rough analogy to explain the idea of meta thinking. Suppose there's a machine that gives you the desired output consistently. And all is good, but after a while, you will ask if there's a way to improve the machine. Maybe make it smaller or more efficient. So similarly, we have all these methods and processes in design, and they work just fine for the most part. But once you take a pause and reflect on your practice, you might find a better way to do things. This pause is meta thinking, reflecting on your own practice, giving it back, and so on. And this can lead to a change in fundamental ideas about design, both in theory and practice. So, in this keynote, we'll talk about philosophical ideas and meta thinking in the understanding and ideation phases of design. And we'll go more meta as we proceed. Finally, we'll just go full meta, where we'll talk about the meaning of design itself. So, let's start with the understanding phase of design, where our purpose is to observe, ask, synthesize before we think of any solutions. And from the world of philosophy, I would like to quote Hannah Arendt, who was one of the biggest philosophers of the 20th century. And she said, "When others understand the same way I understand, it gives me a sense of satisfaction." And doesn't it hold true for our practice too? It's not just that we are understanding, but everybody who's in the team, including our product managers, engineers, they should understand things in the same way so that we can deliver great products. So in the understanding phase, first up, we have the Socratic method, given after one of the earliest and perhaps the most influential Greek philosophers known as Socrates. Now, the Socratic method is well known to both philosophers and lawyers. It's a dialogue approach for doing philosophy, a rally of questions and answers to understand the subject matter more deeply. The key is to ask questions, many of them. Because once you start asking questions, you realize that things are not as straightforward as we once assumed them to be. Also, this is not just asking about the 5 whys, something that we do in a typical design thinking process. The Socratic method goes deep to ask questions that helps everybody to reflect on their thoughts. It's about challenging beliefs, biases, and assumptions which do come into play when we design. And while I understand that you can't get rid of all your existing beliefs and biases, the Socratic method will help you uncover them and understand them better. So let's take a simple example to demonstrate the Socratic method in action. So let's say you are working with a micro blogging product company, and there comes an ask for introducing stories in it. Now, most of us must be familiar with the concept of stories because you can find them in some of the most popular social media products today. Now, when there's an ask for stories in the microblogging product, you can apply the Socratic method. The most obvious question is, well, why do we need stories? And you might get a couple of different replies for it, but let's start with an obvious reply. So you might be told that we need it because there are so many social media platforms using it. To which you can reply, okay, but why are they doing it? And what do we know about their use cases? And to this question, you might just get another reply that, well, it's a trend and we will miss out if we don't do it. So it will be just great to have it on our product. To which you can reply again, but does this trend really supplement or complement our existing experience? Now, at this stage, you are asking everybody to reflect on their thoughts, biases, and assumptions. And that's the purpose of Socratic method. Now, let's see when we have another reply to the question of why do we need stories. So let's say we get the reply that we want people to share their transient thoughts. To which you can ask, okay, can you tell me more about these transient thoughts? Like, why do people want to share them? And you might get a reply that transient thoughts, they just come to you in the flash on the go and you can share them just for fun. To which again you can ask that, but is that like really fun? And if it's fun, can't just people, update through our existing feature on microblogging product? Now again, you are asking people to reflect on their thoughts, to question their beliefs and biases. So I have developed my own little method of asking questions in design that I refer to as the query map. And the idea is to implement the Socratic method to ask questions around people, business, and technology. All these questions are connected to each other, and there are follow-up questions to the initial set of questions. And I'll share a link to the query map in the description below. So let's move ahead with Wittgenstein and language games. Now, Wittgenstein was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century who made significant contributions in analytical philosophy and linguistics. And he is known for his two works, The Picture Theory of Language and Language Games. And today we'll briefly look at language games. So here's the core idea. We know that language is woven into all human activities and behavior. And we use language in different contexts in different ways. So we use language to describe, ask questions, tell stories, express emotions, and so on. And all these different activities are referred by Wittgenstein as language games. And it's a game because you need to understand the rules before you start using language with others. So it means that the language exists in the defined unsaid rules of context, culture, environment, and people. Now that's roughly the idea of language games, but again, let's take some examples to understand it better. So think about the word vector. Now, depending on your profession, you might think of it in different ways. For a designer, it's related to images. For a biologist, it's a disease carrier. And for a physicist, it's a quantity with magnitude and direction. Or let me use this sentence. The agent is working on your ticket. What does it mean? Well, it can mean a travel agent working on your flight ticket, or a support agent working on your technical problem. So that's why it's important to understand the context, the environment, the culture, and the society. That's the reason why ethnographic studies or contextual inquiries have a big role to play when we are designing products. In the enterprise world, where you are designing for large-scale systems, it's important to understand the rules and dynamics of the system before you go ahead about changing things there. Define before you refine. So the next time you are working on a product, think of language games. We use language to express business or user activities, but do we understand this language? And how are people defining good experiences? How are people defining good businesses? Consider spending time learning this language before you start with designs. So let's talk about a Jain philosophy known as Anikantwad. And it talks about different perspectives. So according to Jain philosophy, reality is complex and it has multiple aspects. But we claim to know reality from our own limited experience, and this is where we falter. Now, just a single viewpoint is not going to give us the full picture. And this is best demonstrated using the very famous story of blind men and the elephant, in which, the blind men touch different parts of the elephant. They don't know that they're touching an elephant, but they just touch different parts and they have different perspectives about it. So one of the person who is touching the trunk feels that, well, it's a big snake. And another person who's touching the leg feels that it's a tree stump. While somebody who is touching the elephant's ears feels that, oh, it's a fan or a sheath of leather. And somebody who is touching the tail feels like, it's a rope or it's a flurry mouse. But none of them are getting the full picture because they are just, judging from their own single perspectives. Now, when we are designing, we also often look at things from single perspectives, and sometimes we fail to think about intentions or different misuses of a product. And this is where we lead to unintended consequences. So I believe that we need to think beyond that persona thinking of looking at just some goals and designing for it. We have to consider different intent under different circumstances. And while it's true that we can't have all the answers or all the intents, we can certainly mitigate some of those unintended consequences if we start looking things from different perspectives. So we have some learnings from the understanding phase. First of all, ask a lot of questions and be open to dialogue, and encourage that dialogue approach, the Socratic method, to reflect on your own thoughts and let all other people also reflect on their thoughts. Think of different contexts and perspectives, something that we have learned through language games and the Jain philosophy of Anikantwad. And don't have a unidimensional approach towards your work. Broaden your approach so that you can think of, you can have a very broadened understanding of things and you can think of different perspectives. Anything that's unidimensional will perhaps lead to problems. So let's talk about, some philosophy in the ideation phase. And surprisingly, most insights for me are more meta here than being directly applicable to a certain method or process. So the fundamental question is, how do we design interfaces? What goes into transforming the synthesis of user research or your understanding of the problem into a screen interface? Well, there are some answers. One of them is like we design interfaces based on certain principles related to information architecture, heuristics, and apply them with our understanding of patterns. But my question is it truly that mechanical. We just don't blindly apply patterns, or else everything would have just looked the same. Designing interfaces is in fact a tacit knowledge. You can't explicitly express it through words or writing. There is no stepwise manual for it. Now, I have been thinking a lot about this question of transforming needs to interfaces, and while I don't have a singular objective answer, philosophy has catalyzed some interesting thoughts. So, let's talk a little bit about Hume. Now, he was one of the finest philosophers of the 18th century who made highly influential contributions to empiricism and naturalism. As an empiricist, Hume thinks that everything we believe is ultimately traceable to experience. And he says that our perceptions can be divided into impressions and ideas. Now, impressions include sensations as well as desires, passions, and emotions. And ideas are just the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. And Hume thinks that everyone will recognize this distinction since everyone is aware of the difference between feeling and thinking. It is the difference between, feeling the pain of your present sunburn and recalling the last year's sunburn. Now, let's take this philosophical approach to design. And I'll take a slightly different spin to Hume's impressions and ideas. Now, you get sense impressions all the time from everything around you. There are things that you're directly experiencing. And I think that when these are registered in your memory or conscious experience, they sometimes come into play when you are generating design ideas. And it's not just visual to visual connection. It can be intrasensory. Listening to that calm, peaceful music can lead to minimalistic visual ideas. In cognitive psychology, we call it priming. But in philosophical terms, I can call it generation of complex ideas from impressions. The environment that you're part of will bring different ideas. Spending time in nature will bring different ideas as against spending time in a cubicle. And this is where we can say that designing interfaces is not just a mechanical activity or applying principles and patterns to your synthesis. It has a deeper connection to individuals, to their impressions and ideas. If we understand our emotions, our biases, our environment, our culture, and our influences, we can understand the way in which we shape the interface. So, this is, perhaps this thought is a natural segue to the next topic, which is intuition and intellect. Now, this was discussed by Radhakrishnan in his epistemological studies. And Radhakrishnan was the first Vice President of India and also one of the finest Indian philosophers. Now, he says that on one hand, we have our intellectual cognition to obtain knowledge through the process of analysis and synthesis. While on the other hand, we have intuitive apprehension. What is intuitive apprehension? Well, according to Radhakrishnan, it's a direct knowledge culminating in the highest kind of immediacy, which simply means that knowing something immediately without any data. It's your years of experience coming together and emerging as intuition. And note that intuition is not instinct. All animals have instinct. In fact, animals have far better instincts because of survival. It's natural. But intuition, on the other hand, is not your gut feeling or instinct. It's emergence of knowledge accumulated over years. Now, what about intuition and intellect together? Now, here Radhakrishnan says that intuition needs intellect for the expression, elaboration, and justification of its results. Intellect, on the other hand, presupposes intuition, without which its deliberation cannot start. So the function of intellect is analysis, but there must be something to be analyzed, and that something must be whole, which is intuition. Now, think about this when you are ideating. Any idea begins with a certain intuition, which gets better with experience. The kickoff point is driven by your intuition. that blank canvas will perhaps look more intimidating to somebody who's just starting in design as compared to somebody who has spent years in it. And as you start working on the idea, your intellect comes also into play, and various elements in your design gets connected to your research synthesis and all the background work that you have done. So I do believe that you need to provide rationales for your design, but you're not exactly analytical when you are designing. So I feel that design is driven by intuition, but defined by intellect. So with that, we can now go even more meta, which brings us to the question, what is design? How do we define design? But before we answer this question, I would like to share a few thoughts on why do we even need a personal definition of design. And I understand that our own definitions of designs are always evolving, but it's still important to have our own definitions. The way we understand things or it shapes our actions. So let's say that you say that design is problem solving, and with that definition, you will find yourself looking at design perhaps in a mechanical way. Take a problem and solve it, much like math. But is design just problem solving? We just learned a few slides back that there's a lot of things associated with design. You have the society, the culture, the environment, and the human subjectivity. So design's got to be more than just problem solving. The way we define design is the way we'll practice it. And that's why our definitions are important. They bring clarity, purpose, and a way to work. So with that, I can share my own definition of design. So design for me is structuring of material to let beings attain their intended task with minimum learning. Let's break it down. So when you're designing, you're always structuring certain material. Now this material can be a physical material, or it can be information, it can be interface components. But there is always this structuring of material happening with a certain plan in mind. And why is this structuring of material happening? Well, we want beings, which can be not just humans but also animals, to attain their goals with minimum learning. So minimum learning does include things like having proper affordances or proper having signifiers, and it has to be inclusive. So that's why design for me is structuring of material to let beings attain their intended task with minimum learning. So whenever I'm doing design, there's this definition which is always there in the background, which helps me drive my work. So with that, let's look at some of the takeaways from this keynote. First of all, you should have an obsession with understanding, which can be driven through the Socratic method, wherein we ask a lot of questions, we go with the dialogue approach, and we try to get at the root of what we want to understand. We need to understand the dynamics of the systems, and we need to look through diverse perspectives. And that's where the idea of language games can perhaps help us, or the giant philosophy of Anikantwad. And then it's great if we can reflect on the ideation process, if we can understand our impressions, if we can understand intuition and the way we are applying analytical ideas to to kind of go ahead from our intuition and defining the design with intellect. But I think for me, one of the biggest takeaway is to go meta. You have to look inside to change the outside. Thank you.